June 1121. King David IV faced 40,000 Seljuk Turks with 15,000 men. His advisors begged retreat into the mountains. Instead, he unleashed 700 armored cavalry in a direct charge into the enemy's heart. Suicide by every rule of war. What happened in the next 3 hours defied logic. An empire's army disintegrated. Bodies blocked mountain passes. This is Didgori, the most devastating cavalry charge in medieval history, where 700 Georgian horsemen shattered an army and saved a kingdom. August 12th, 1121. The Nichbisi Valley, 30 miles west of Tbilisi. King David IV stood on a rocky ridge, watching his kingdom's death approach from the south. The horizon was black with horsemen. Not a storm, not a shadow. An army. 40,000 men, maybe more. The Seljuk Turks had come to finish what they'd started decades ago. David was 32 years old. He'd spent half his life preparing for this moment. Now it was here, and the mathematics were brutal. 15,000 Georgian soldiers behind him, 40,000 Seljuk Turks ahead, nearly 3-to-1 odds. His advisors were already talking about retreat. Captain Georgian Horsemen approached, his face tight with worry. "Your Majesty, we should pull back into the mountains. Fight them in the passes where numbers don't matter." David didn't answer. He was watching the Seljuk vanguard deploy. Perfectly disciplined formations, banners snapping in the wind. These weren't raiders or bandits. This was the army that had crushed Byzantium at Manzikert. The army that had swept through Persia like wildfire. The army that had never lost a major battle. Behind David stood 700 men. Kipchak horsemen, heavily armored, the best cavalry in the Caucasus. He'd spent years training them. Years preparing for a battle everyone said would never come. It came. Prince Zagan Abuleti joined them on the ridge. "My king, if we stay here, we die. Every man knows it. We can't win this fight." David turned to face his officers. Both men had fought beside him for over a decade. Both were asking him to run. He understood why. The Seljuk Empire stretched from Afghanistan to Anatolia. They'd conquered kingdoms that made Georgia look like a village. They had resources, manpower, and momentum that seemed unstoppable. But David had spent 20 years watching Georgia die slowly. Tribute payments bleeding the treasury. Seljuk governors ruling Georgian cities. His own father forced to bow to Turkish overlords. Every year, another piece of the kingdom carved away. "Retreat into the mountains," David said quietly. "And what happens next? We hide in caves while they burn Tbilisi? We watch from the hills while they enslave our people?" He looked back at the approaching army. "They'll chase us into those mountains. They'll hunt us down in the passes. And when they find us, we'll still be outnumbered, but exhausted and scattered." Georgie started to protest, but David cut him off. "If we run today, we'll run tomorrow, and the day after. Eventually, we run out of mountains." He paused, letting that sink in. "Someone has to draw a line. I'm drawing it here." The silence stretched. Then David gave the order that would either save Georgia or destroy it. "Prepare the 700 for a direct charge into their center. We're going to break them where they think they're strongest." His officers stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had. But David had learned something his enemies hadn't. Sometimes the only way to survive is to do the impossible. To understand what David was facing, you need to understand what the Seljuk Turks had become by 1121. This wasn't some tribal confederation. This was the most powerful Islamic empire since the early caliphates. The great Seljuk Empire controlled everything from the Hindu Kush to the Mediterranean coast. At its peak, it ruled over 25 million people. Their armies had shattered kingdoms that had stood for centuries. 1171. Manzikert. The Byzantine Empire, 1,000 years old, met the Seljuks in eastern Anatolia. The Byzantines fielded 40,000 troops, including the elite Varangian Guard. The Seljuks annihilated them in a single afternoon. Emperor Romanos IV was captured, his army destroyed. The Byzantine heartland lay open. Within a decade, the Turks controlled most of Anatolia. A Christian empire that had survived barbarians, Persians, and Arabs fell to Turkish horse archers. 1096, the First Crusade reached Anatolia. European knights, the finest heavy cavalry in Christendom, confident and zealous. The Seljuks used them for target practice. The Crusaders learned quickly that their tactics meant nothing against an enemy that could shoot accurately at full gallop. 1119. The Field of Blood. Ilghazi ibn Artuk, the man now commanding the army at Didgori, trapped a Crusader force in Syria. 7,000 Christian soldiers killed. The Prince of Antioch beheaded. It wasn't even close. The Seljuk military system was built on mobility and discipline. Their core strength was horse archers, riders who'd learned to shoot before they could walk. They could fire backwards at full retreat, a tactic called the Parthian shot. They'd feign retreat, draw enemies into ambushes, then wheel around and slaughter them. They also fielded heavy cavalry when needed. Ghulams, slave soldiers trained from childhood. And they had numbers. The empire could field armies that dwarfed anything Christian kingdoms could muster. But their greatest weapon was psychological. For 50 years they'd been winning. Every battle, every siege, every campaign. That creates momentum. It makes soldiers believe they're invincible. It makes enemies afraid before the fighting even starts. By 1121, the Seljuks had conquered or vassalized every kingdom in the Caucasus except Georgia. Armenia had fallen decades ago. The mountain tribes paid tribute. Azerbaijan was Turkish territory. Georgia stood alone, a Christian kingdom surrounded by an Islamic empire. The Seljuks had been patient, content to collect tribute and wait for Georgia to collapse on its own. Then David stopped paying. Worse, he started winning. Small victories at first, border skirmishes, reclaiming fortresses. But enough to embarrass the empire. Sultan Mahmud II had tolerated it for a while. By 1121, his patience ended. He assembled an army specifically to destroy Georgia, not to conquer it, to erase it. The force he sent was overwhelming by design. 40,000 troops, maybe more. Contemporary sources vary, but all agree it was massive. Turks, Persians, Arabs, tributary forces from across the empire. Professional soldiers led by experienced commanders. Their objective wasn't subtle. March through Georgia, kill or enslave everyone, burn every city, and leave nothing but ash. Make an example that would terrify any other kingdom thinking about resistance. They came through Armenia in summer, 1121. Villages burned behind them. Refugees fled north with stories of massacres. The army moved slowly, deliberately, letting fear spread ahead of them. By August, they'd reached the Georgian border. David had run out of time. David was born in 1073 to a kingdom on its knees. Georgia, once proud and independent, had become a tributary state. Every year, his father, King George II, sent gold, silver, and slaves to the Seljuk overlords. The humiliation was total. Turkish governors ruled Georgian cities. Muslim merchants controlled trade. Christian churches were taxed into poverty. Georgian nobles who protested were executed or exiled. David grew up watching his father bow to men who despised him. He learned early that submission doesn't buy safety. it only buys time. When David was 6, Seljuk raiders attacked a monastery near Tbilisi. They killed the monks, burned the buildings, and took the treasures. His father did nothing, couldn't do anything. The treaty forbade retaliation. That's the memory that shaped David. Not the violence itself, but his father's helplessness. The look on the king's face when he received news of the raid. Rage and shame and crushing impotence. David decided then that he'd never wear that expression. He'd rather die fighting than live bowing. 1089. David was 16 when his father died. The crown passed to him at an age when most boys are still learning to fight. He was expected to continue his father's policies. Pay tribute, avoid conflict, manage decline. Instead, David stopped the payments. Just stopped. Sent a message to the Seljuk governor in Tbilisi that Georgia would no longer submit. His advisors thought he'd lost his mind. The Seljuks would destroy them. They'd send an army that would wipe Georgia off the map. David's response was simple. Let them come. We're dying slowly anyway. I'd rather die quickly on our feet than spend another decade on our knees. But David wasn't suicidal. He was calculating. He understood something about empires that most people missed. They're strong at their center, weak at their edges. Georgia was at the edge. The Seljuks were fighting wars in Persia, in Anatolia, against crusaders in Syria. They didn't have unlimited resources. If Georgia could make itself too expensive to conquer, maybe the empire would leave them alone. So David started building, not just walls and fortresses, but an army. The problem was manpower. Georgia's population was maybe 1 million. The Seljuk Empire had 25 times that. David needed soldiers who could match Turkish cavalry. He found them in the last place anyone expected. The Kipchak steppes north of the Caucasus. The same tribes that provided warriors to the Seljuk armies. 1093. David sent envoys north with an offer. Gold, land, and citizenship to any Kipchak warriors who'd settle in Georgia and fight for him. 40,000 accepted. The Georgian nobility was horrified. These were pagans, barely civilized, the same people who'd been raiding Georgia for generations. David was inviting the enemy inside their borders. David didn't care about their objections. He needed cavalry who could fight the Seljuk style. The Kipchaks were perfect. They knew the tactics, understood the weapons, and most importantly, they could ride and shoot like Turks. He spent years integrating them, gave them land in eastern Georgia, let them keep their customs, slowly converted some to Christianity, but didn't force it, built trust through respect and shared interest. By 1100, David had an army, not just Georgian infantry, but Kipchak horse archers and heavy cavalry. He started testing them in small campaigns, raiding Turkish positions, ambushing supply columns, reclaiming border fortresses. He won more often than he lost. Each victory brought more soldiers to his banner. Each defeat taught him lessons he'd use later. By 1121, David had transformed Georgia from a dying tributary into a legitimate military power. The Seljuks finally noticed, and they decided to end it. David understood that cavalry wins battles, but elite cavalry wins wars. Between 1093 and 1118, he built something unprecedented in the Caucasus. An armored shock force that could break enemy lines through sheer kinetic violence. The Monaspa, Georgia's heavy cavalry, selected from the best Kipchak and Georgian warriors. They trained year-round, not just in spring before campaign season. They practiced formations, charges, close quarters fighting. They learned to function as a single organism. Standard cavalry wore leather or light chain mail. The Manaspa wore full armor, lamellar plates covering chest and back, chainmail protecting arms and legs, steel helmets with face guards. Their horses wore armor too, plates protecting the chest and flanks. They carried 12-foot lances, heavy enough to punch through shields and mail. Backup weapons included swords, axes, and maces. Everything designed for close combat, the brutal work of breaking formations. Training was relentless. David drilled them in wedge formations, the ancient tactic Alexander had used. The wedge concentrated force at a single point, driving deep into enemy lines like a spear through flesh. They practiced charges over and over, holding formation at full gallop, staying tight even as horses stumbled or men fell, because a scattered charge was just suicide on horseback. A disciplined wedge was a battering ram. But David's real innovation was selection. He didn't just take anyone who could ride. He tested them. Physical endurance, riding skill, weapons proficiency. More importantly, psychological stability. Men who panicked under pressure didn't make it. By 1120, David had approximately 2,000 Manaspa cavalry. From those, he selected the best 700, the elite of the elite. These would be his personal guard, the tip of his spear, the weapon he'd use when everything else failed. The decision to use Seljuk Turks was controversial, even after years of integration. Georgian nobles still distrusted them. Church officials worried about pagan influence. Common soldiers questioned their loyalty. David settled the debate through action. He fought alongside them, led charges personally, shared the same risks. When a Seljuk warrior saved his life during a skirmish in 1115, David made him a prince. The message was clear. Loyalty mattered more than blood. The Seljuks responded to that trust. They'd been mercenaries for the Seljuks, hired muscle with no stake in victory. In Georgia, David gave them land, citizenship, respect. He made them part of something larger than themselves. By 1121, the 700 weren't just soldiers. They were believers. They'd drunk the same water as David. They'd listened to him talk about Georgia not as a kingdom, but as an idea. A place where loyalty mattered more than ethnicity, where courage earned respect, where small nations could defy empires. It sounds like propaganda, and maybe it was. But propaganda works when soldiers believe it, and the 700 believed. They also believed in David personally. He'd proven himself in a dozen battles. He didn't give orders from safe positions. He fought in the front ranks. He'd been wounded 3 times. Everyone knew he'd die before he'd retreat. That created a bond stronger than discipline or fear. These men would follow him anywhere because they'd seen him lead from the front. Because he'd never asked them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. When David stood on that ridge in August 1121, looking at 40,000 Seljuk Turks, he had 15,000 soldiers behind him. But the 700 heavy cavalry were his real army. They were the weapon that would break the empire, if they could survive the charge. Sultan Mahmud II was tired of hearing about Georgia. For years, it had been an irritant, a minor kingdom that refused to know its place. David had stopped tribute payments, raided Turkish positions, even recaptured territory. Embarrassing, but not strategically critical. The empire had larger problems: wars in Persia, crusader states in Syria, internal succession disputes. Georgia could wait. By 1120, Mahmud's patience evaporated. David wasn't just defending anymore. He was winning, pushing south, threatening Turkish-held cities, making the empire look weak. Mahmud understood something about empires that David was exploiting. They survive on fear. Tributary states pay gold and bow their heads because they believe resistance is futile. But if one kingdom defies the empire and survives, others start questioning. Georgia's defiance was contagious. Reports came from across the Caucasus. Tribes that had been paying tribute were suddenly late with payments. Armenian nobles were whispering about independence. The whole region was watching Georgia and wondering if maybe the Seljuks weren't invincible after all. Mahmud couldn't allow that. He assembled an overwhelming force, 40,000 troops, pulled from garrisons across the empire, the largest army ever sent against Georgia. The message was clear: submit or be annihilated. He chose his commander carefully, Ilghazi ibn Artuk, age 65, a veteran of 50 years of warfare. He'd fought in Persia, Anatolia, and Syria. He'd crushed crusader armies. He'd never failed to take a city or win a battle. Ilghazi was called the Bloodthirsty for good reason. After the Field of Blood in 1119, he'd executed every captured crusader officer personally. He didn't just win battles, he made examples. The army Ilghazi commanded was built for total destruction. Professional Turkish cavalry, 10,000 strong. Persian infantry, armored and disciplined. Arab auxiliary units, tributary forces from conquered kingdoms, proving their loyalty through service. They had siege equipment, supply trains, engineers. Everything needed for a sustained campaign. The plan wasn't just to defeat David's army. It was to occupy Georgia, burn every city, execute every noble, and reduce the population to slavery. Summer 1121. The army marched north through Armenia. They moved slowly, deliberately. Let the terror spread. Villages in their path evacuated. Those that didn't were burned. Refugees fled north with stories of massacres, torture, mass executions. Ilghazi wanted David to hear those stories, wanted him to understand what was coming, wanted him afraid. But if Ilghazi expected David to panic or negotiate, he misunderstood his opponent. David had spent his entire adult life preparing for this moment. He'd known since he stopped tribute payments that eventually the empire would come to finish him. He'd prepared Georgia for total war, stockpiled food and weapons in fortresses, trained civilians in basic defense, made plans for guerrilla warfare if the field army was destroyed. He'd even arranged for his son to escape to Byzantium if the worst happened. David wasn't delusional. He knew the odds. 40,000 professional soldiers led by one of the empire's best commanders against his 15,000. Mathematics said he'd lose. But David had an advantage Ilghazi didn't know about. He'd been studying Seljuk tactics for 20 years. He understood their strengths and their weaknesses. He knew how they deployed, how they fought, how they won. And he'd built his army specifically to counter them. The 700 heavy cavalry weren't just elite troops. They were a weapon designed for a single purpose: to punch through Turkish cavalry lines and kill the commanders before the enemy could adapt. It was a desperate strategy. It required perfect timing, perfect execution, and a lot of luck. If anything went wrong, the 700 would die and Georgia would fall. But David was done running, done hiding, done watching his kingdom die slowly. He'd gamble everything on one battle, one charge, one moment when courage and preparation might overcome impossible odds. August 1121. Ilghazi's army reached the Nichbisi Valley. David's army was waiting. August 1121, evening. The Georgian army camped 3 miles north of Didgori, a small fortress on the mountain road to Tbilisi. David's scouts reported the Seljuk army's position. They'd camp tonight, attack tomorrow. David called his war council. 12 men crowded into a command tent lit by oil lamps. Maps spread across a wooden table showed the terrain, the roads, the ridge lines where they might make a stand. Prince Zagan spoke first. "We should fall back to the fortress. Hold there until reinforcements arrive." "There are no reinforcements," David said quietly. "We're alone." "Then we retreat further north," Captain Georgi argued. "Fight in the mountain passes where their numbers don't matter." David studied the map. He'd been over this terrain 100 times. He knew every ridge, every valley, every approach. And he knew that retreat meant death. "They'll chase us into those mountains," he said. "Hunt us down in scattered groups. We'll still be outnumbered but exhausted and disorganized." He looked up at his officers. "If we run now, we'll never stop running." The tent fell silent. Everyone understood what he was saying. Stand here or die slowly in the hills? Neither option was good. David made his decision. "Tomorrow morning, we meet them in the valley." "Open battle?" Several officers started talking at once, objecting, questioning, calculating odds. David let them argue for a moment, then raised his hand. "Listen to me. The Seljuks expect us to hide, to defend, to delay. They'll deploy for a siege or a pursuit. They won't expect us to attack." He tapped the map. "We'll use that against them." "How do you attack 40,000 men with 15,000? Georgi asked. "You don't attack the 40,000, David said. "You attack the command structure. Kill the generals. Break the center, create chaos. Once their formations collapse, numbers don't matter as much." He looked at each man in turn. "The 700 will charge directly into their center. Full speed, wedge formation. We'll break through, kill their commanders, and shatter their morale." "That's suicide," Prince Didgori said flatly. David nodded. "It should be. But they won't expect it. Heavy cavalry doesn't charge into superior numbers. It flanks, it maneuvers, it waits for opportunities. We're not going to do any of that. We're going to hit them head on before they're ready." The silence that followed was heavy. Every man in that tent understood what David was proposing. A direct charge into the heart of an enemy army. The kind of tactic that got written in history books because it was either brilliant or catastrophic. Georgi finally spoke. "If the 700 break, we all die." David met his gaze. "If the 700 break, we were going to die anyway. At least this way we die fighting instead of running." He stood, the discussion over. "Get some sleep. Make your peace with God. Tomorrow we find out if courage can beat numbers." The officers filed out slowly, each lost in their own thoughts. David stayed behind, staring at the map. He wasn't praying. He was calculating angles, timing, distance, the mathematics of violence. Outside, soldiers sharpened swords and checked armor. Some prayed, some wrote letters they hoped someone would deliver to families if they died. Some just sat in silence, staring at fires, thinking about tomorrow. The 700 heavy cavalry prepared their horses, checked their lances, adjusted their armor. They knew they'd be the tip of the spear. The first to charge, the first to die if things went wrong. But they'd chosen this. Every one of them had volunteered to be David's guard. They'd sworn oaths, not just to him, but to Georgia. To the idea that a small nation could defy an empire if it was willing to pay the price. Tonight, that price looked very high. Tomorrow they'd find out if it was worth paying. David's senior commanders were men shaped by decades of frontier warfare. They'd fought alongside him since he was a teenager. They'd survived battles that should have killed them. They trusted David because he'd earned it through blood and competence. Georgi Chikondideli was David's cousin and closest friend. Age 35, stocky and scarred, he commanded the left-wing cavalry. He'd been fighting Seljuk raiders since he was 16. He understood Turkish tactics better than most Turkish commanders. Georgi had saved David's life twice. Once during an ambush in 1108 when a Seljuk arrow missed David's head by inches. Georgi killed the archer, then 3 more who tried to finish the job. The second time was at Rustavi in 1117, when David got separated from his guards during a street fight. Georgi fought through 20 men to reach him. That created a bond deeper than blood. David trusted Georgi to lead the cavalry because he'd proven himself in situations where most men would break. He was steady, competent, and absolutely fearless. Prince Dzagan Abuledi commanded the infantry. Age 42, tall and grim, he'd fought in every major battle since 1102. He was a defensive specialist, skilled at holding positions that seemed indefensible. His soldiers called him the Wall because he never retreated. Dzagan was also brutally honest. If David proposed something stupid, Dzagan would say so. That made him invaluable. Kings surrounded by yes-men make fatal mistakes. David needed advisors who'd tell him the truth even when it was uncomfortable. The Kipchak chieftains formed another tier of leadership. These were men who'd come south 20 years ago as mercenaries and stayed as citizens. They commanded the horse archer units and the heavy cavalry. Otruk was the senior Kipchak leader. Age 50, he'd been raiding caravans on the steppes when David's envoys found him. He'd agreed to the Georgian offer because David promised land and respect. He got both. Now he commanded 2,000 cavalry and held estates in eastern Georgia. Otruk brought something crucial to David's army. He understood Seljuk tactics from the inside. He'd fought for and against them. He knew their formations, their signals, their habits. That knowledge had won David multiple battles. There was also Baramuk, a younger Kipchak chief who commanded 500 horse archers. Age 30, aggressive and talented, he distinguished himself in border skirmishes. David was grooming him for higher command. These men weren't just following orders. They believed in David personally. He'd kept his promises, given them land, titles, respect, treated them as equals instead of hired foreigners. That loyalty was absolute because it was earned. On the night before Didgori, these commanders gathered one final time. They shared wine, told stories, reminded each other why they fought. Some talked about their families, others about the battles they'd survived. A few sat in silence, making peace with the possibility of death. David moved among them quietly. He didn't make speeches or try to inspire them with grand words. He simply sat with each man for a few minutes, asked about their preparations, listened to concerns, made small adjustments to the plan. This was David's gift as a leader. He made each soldier feel seen, valued, essential. He remembered names, families, injuries from old battles. He made leadership personal. Around midnight, the commanders dispersed to their units. Each had final orders, contingency plans, and signals for retreat if everything went wrong. David had prepared for every possibility except surrender. Georgi stayed behind. He and David sat in silence for a while, just 2 men who'd known each other their entire lives, facing the possibility that tomorrow they'd die. Finally, Georgi spoke. "If we don't make it, it's been an honor." David gripped his cousin's shoulder. "We'll make it. We always do." It was a lie, and both knew it. But sometimes lies are kinder than truth. They clasped forearms. Then Georgi left to join his cavalry. David sat alone, watching the camp settle into uneasy sleep. Tomorrow would decide everything. Victory or annihilation. Glory or oblivion. No middle ground. He closed his eyes and prayed. Not for victory, just for courage. August 12th, 1121. Dawn broke cold and clear over the Nishbisi Valley. Georgian soldiers woke to the smell of wood smoke and fear. Men checked weapons one final time, adjusted armor, said quiet prayers. David was already awake. He hadn't slept. He'd spent the night reviewing plans, checking supplies, walking through the camp. Now he stood on the command ridge, watching the eastern horizon. The Seljuk army appeared just after sunrise. They came across the valley floor like a dark tide. 40,000 men spreading across 2 miles of terrain. Their banners caught the morning light. Green, black, red. The colors of the Seljuk Empire. The sound reached the Georgian positions first. Drums, rhythmic and deep. Then voices, thousands of men chanting prayers. Then the jingle of horse harness and the creak of wagon wheels. The sound of an empire on the move. Georgian soldiers watched in silence. Many had never seen an army this large. The psychological impact was immediate. How do you fight something that fills the horizon? How do you stand against a force that seems infinite? David understood that fear. He'd felt it himself in his first battles. The terror of facing overwhelming numbers. The animal instinct screaming at you to run, to hide, to survive. He rode along the Georgian lines slowly. Let his soldiers see him, calm, unhurried, confident. He stopped occasionally to speak with units, not speeches, just quiet words. Reminders that they'd trained for this, that they knew what to do, that he believed in them. By mid-morning, the Seljuk army had deployed. Cavalry on the wings, infantry in the center, command group behind the lines. Textbook formation, proven over decades of victories. They moved with the confidence of soldiers who'd never lost. Ilghazi ibn Artuk sat on horseback surrounded by his officers, studying the Georgian position through the dust. The enemy was on high ground, defensive formation. Exactly what he'd expected. His strategy was straightforward. Send cavalry to probe the flanks. Use archers to wear down their formations. Then push infantry forward to engage, while cavalry enveloped them from both sides. Standard tactics that had worked 100 times before. What Ilghazi didn't know was that David had no intention of fighting a defensive battle. The high ground position was theater. The defensive formations were bait. Behind the ridge, hidden from Seljuk view, the 700 heavy cavalry waited. They'd been positioned there before dawn, horses calm, lances ready, every man focused on the signal that would start the charge. David's plan required precise timing. He needed the Seljuks deployed and committed. Needed their cavalry spread across the wings, needed their infantry moving forward, needed their command group confident and exposed. Around noon, David sent envoys under a white flag. They rode into the valley, approaching the Seljuk lines. They carried a message requesting negotiations, peace talks, a chance to discuss terms. Ilghazi received the envoys with barely concealed contempt. This was weakness. David was looking for a way out. The envoys were instructed to return with terms for Georgia's surrender. Total submission, payment of back tribute, hostages, the usual demands. The envoys returned to the Georgian lines. David read the terms aloud to his officers, then tore the document in half. Send them back with my answer. Georgia does not negotiate with invaders. But the negotiations had accomplished their purpose. Ilghazi was convinced David would fight defensively. The Seljuk army relaxed slightly, prepared for a grinding frontal assault against fortified positions. They never saw the 700. David gave the signal. A single horn blast, high and clear. Behind the ridge, cavalry commanders repeated the order. Mount up, form the wedge, prepare to charge. 700 horsemen moved into position. The wedge formation, narrow at the point, widening toward the rear. Every man in his place. Lances lowered, armor gleaming in the sunlight. David took his position at the tip of the wedge. Not behind his soldiers, but ahead of them. The first to charge, the first to hit the enemy, the first to die if things went wrong. Georgie rode up beside him. "My king, you don't have to lead this. Let me take the point." David shook his head. "I ordered this charge. I'll lead it." The 700 waited. Horses stamping, men breathing hard, adrenaline building. This was the moment. Everything came down to the next 10 minutes. David looked back at his cavalry. These men who trusted him, followed him, believed in him. He raised his sword. "For Georgia," he shouted. "For freedom. For every village they burned and every family they enslaved. Make them pay for every inch." Then he spurred his horse forward. The 700 followed, thunder rising from the earth. The charge began with careful control. 700 horsemen moving at a trot, maintaining formation. The wedge stayed tight, every rider in position. David at the point, officers flanking him, the mass of armored cavalry behind. They crested the ridge, and the Seljuk army saw them. For a moment, there was confusion in the Turkish ranks. Cavalry charging from an unexpected direction, not flanking, not maneuvering. Coming straight down the slope toward their center. Ilghazi's officers started shouting orders. Cavalry units on the wings began turning. Infantry formations shifted. Archers drew arrows. But they were reacting, not anticipating. That split second of confusion was exactly what David needed. The 700 accelerated to a canter. Still, controlled, still tight. The ground shook under 2,000 hooves. The sound built like approaching thunder. Men who'd never heard a heavy cavalry charge stood frozen, trying to process what they were seeing. Turkish cavalry moved to intercept. Light horsemen, fast and mobile, expert at harassment and retreat. They'd stop this charge, break it up, force the Georgians to scatter. They never got the chance. At 200 yards, David gave the order. The 700 went a full gallop. The physics of heavy cavalry at full speed are brutal. Each horse weighed half a ton. Add a fully armored rider, and the total mass approached 1,300 pounds. Multiply that by 700, and you had 1,000 tons of steel and flesh moving at 30 miles per hour. Nothing stops that. You either get out of the way, or you die. The Turkish cavalry tried to form a defensive line. They had seconds to organize. Some got into position. Most were still moving when the wedge hit them. The impact was catastrophic. Georgian lances punched through shields, through leather armor, through men and horses alike. The first rank of Turkish cavalry simply disintegrated. Horses went down screaming. Riders were crushed under Georgian hooves or impaled on lances. The wedge drove deeper. David's lance shattered on the first impact. He drew his sword, leaning low over his horse's neck, cutting and stabbing. Men around him fought with focused violence. No war cries, no wasted energy. Just professional soldiers doing the brutal work they'd trained for. The Turkish center buckled. Units that should have held broke apart. Cavalry that should have counterattacked retreated instead. The psychological shock was as effective as the physical violence. This wasn't supposed to happen. Heavy cavalry didn't charge into superior numbers and win. But the 700 were winning. They'd broken through the first defensive line. Now they were into the Turkish infantry formations. Soldiers on foot tried to form pike walls, tried to create barriers. The Georgian cavalry smashed through them. Horses trampled men who couldn't move fast enough. Georgian swords and axes cut down anyone in reach. The wedge, still remarkably intact despite the carnage, drove toward the Seljuk command group. Ilghazi saw them coming, saw his center collapsing, saw cavalry that should have stopped this charge fleeing instead. He started giving orders, trying to redirect forces, trying to contain the breakthrough. Too late. The 700 were already through his front lines. His personal guard, elite troops who'd never retreated from anything, found themselves facing armored horsemen covered in blood and momentum. David fought in the front rank. He'd lost count of how many men he'd killed. His sword was notched and bloody. His armor had taken hits that would have killed an unarmored man. But he was still mounted, still moving, still leading. The Georgian cavalry hit the command group like a hammer. Officers died before they could draw weapons. Command banners fell. The carefully organized Seljuk army suddenly had no center, no coordination, no control. And that's when panic set in. Units on the flanks, seeing their command structure destroyed, began to waver. The infantry, under pressure from Georgian light troops, started looking for escape routes. The charge had lasted maybe 10 minutes. 10 minutes of violence that broke an army that should have been unbreakable. The 700 emerged on the far side of the Seljuk center. Behind them lay a corridor of dead and dying. The Turkish army's center had a hole in it. David rallied his cavalry. They'd taken casualties, maybe 100 riders down. But 600 remained, and the enemy was breaking. Now came the pursuit. The Seljuk army, disciplined and confident an hour ago, dissolved into chaos. Units that had never retreated suddenly found themselves surrounded, leaderless, desperate. The Georgian breakthrough had decapitated their command structure. Officers were dead or scattered. Nobody knew who was in charge. Panic is contagious in armies. It starts with one unit breaking, then spreads to neighboring formations. Soldiers look around, see others running, decide they should run too. Within minutes, an organized army becomes a mob of terrified individuals trying to survive. That's what happened at Didgori. The Seljuk center collapsed completely. Infantry threw down their weapons and fled. Cavalry units that should have counterattacked retreated instead. The wings, isolated and confused, began pulling back. David didn't give them time to reorganize. He signaled the rest of his army. The light cavalry on the flanks charged. The infantry advanced from the high ground. The 700, bloodied but intact, wheeled around for another pass. The Seljuk army broke completely. 40,000 men, the pride of the empire, turned and ran. They fled south, back toward the mountain passes they'd come through. The roads clogged with soldiers, horses, abandoned equipment. The Georgian pursuit was merciless. Light cavalry chased down fleeing soldiers. Archers shot into packed masses of retreating troops. The 700 heavy cavalry charged again and again, breaking any unit that tried to make a stand. Contemporary chronicles describe the carnage in horrific detail. Bodies lined the roads for miles. Mountain passes became killing grounds where fleeing Seljuks trapped themselves. Rivers ran red, the air filled with screams. Some Turkish units tried to surrender. The Georgians showed no mercy. 20 years of raids, tribute payments, humiliation, burned villages. All of that came out in the pursuit. Prisoners were cut down. Wounded men were finished where they lay. This wasn't a battle anymore. It was a slaughter, and it continued all afternoon. The Georgians pursued the broken army for 15 miles, killing until they were too exhausted to lift their weapons. Ilgazi escaped. His personal guard, what was left of it, managed to extract him from the battlefield. He fled south with maybe 1,000 survivors. Later accounts describe him as broken, barely able to speak, traumatized by the impossibility of what had happened. By evening, the pursuit ended. Georgian soldiers returned to Didgori, exhausted, covered in blood, struggling to process what they'd done. They'd faced an army that outnumbered them 3-1. They'd not only won, they'd annihilated it. The battlefield was nightmare terrain. Thousands of corpses spread across miles, wounded men crying for help, dead horses, broken equipment, discarded weapons. the smell of blood and death thick in the air. David walked among the dead that evening. His armor was dented and blood-stained. He was wounded, minor cuts and bruises from the charge. He moved slowly, almost mechanically, checking on his soldiers, speaking quietly with survivors. The 700 had lost approximately 150 men. 20% casualties, horrific by any standard. But they'd broken an empire's army. The mathematics of war said that was impossible. They'd done it anyway. Georgian infantry units reported similar losses. Total casualties for David's army, approximately 1,000 killed, maybe 2,000 wounded. 15% of his force. Devastating numbers. But the Seljuk casualties defied comprehension. Conservative estimates suggested 25,000 dead. Some chronicles claimed 40,000. Exact numbers were impossible to determine because the pursuit had scattered bodies over such a wide area. Even the low estimate meant a kill ratio of 25-1, numbers that seemed absurd. But multiple sources, Georgian and Turkish, confirmed the scale of the disaster. Night fell over Didgori. Georgian soldiers made camps among the dead. Some prayed, some wept. Some sat in stunned silence, trying to understand that they'd survived. David stood alone on the ridge where he'd watched the Seljuk army approach that morning. 12 hours ago, he'd been preparing to die. Now he'd won the greatest victory in Georgian history. But he felt no triumph, just exhaustion and the terrible weight of command. 1,000 of his men dead, more wounded, families destroyed, all because he'd refused to retreat. The victory was total. The cost was unbearable. That's the truth of war that nobody tells you until after. August 13th, 1121. Dawn broke over a silent battlefield. Georgian soldiers woke to the reality of what they'd done. The euphoria of survival had faded. Now came the grim work of aftermath. The first task was caring for Georgian wounded. 2,000 men needed medical attention, everything from minor cuts to amputated limbs. Field medics worked with primitive tools and knowledge. Many who'd survived the battle would die from infections in the following days. Screams echoed from the makeshift hospitals. Soldiers held down wounded comrades while medics cut away shattered armor, stitched wounds, amputated mangled limbs. No anesthesia except wine and prayer. Men bit down on leather straps and tried not to scream. Prince Zagan lost his left hand during the final pursuit. A Turkish scimitar had nearly severed it. Medics finished the amputation in a field hospital while Zagan, pale and sweating, refused to cry out. He'd command troops one-handed for the rest of his life. The second task was counting and burying the dead. Georgian soldiers were gathered, identified when possible, and buried in mass graves with Christian rites. Priests walked among the dead, offering prayers, making crosses over bodies. Some soldiers couldn't be identified. Armor crushed, faces destroyed, no possessions to mark them. They were buried nameless in common graves. Their families would never know what happened to them. The Seljuk dead presented a different problem. There were too many. 25,000 corpses spread across miles of terrain. You couldn't bury them all. You couldn't even count them accurately. David ordered the dead collected and burned. Massive pyres were built. Bodies stacked like cordwood and set ablaze. The smoke rose for days, visible from miles away. A gray pillar marking where an army had died. The smell was indescribable. Burning flesh, wood smoke, decay. It settled over the valley like a shroud. Soldiers tied cloth over their faces and worked in shifts, trying not to vomit. The stench would linger for weeks. Personal stories emerged from the survivors. A Georgian foot soldier named Tornike had killed 4 Turkish horsemen during the pursuit. He'd never been in combat before Didgori. Now he sat by a fire, staring at his hands unable to speak. A Kipchak warrior named Bakir had charged with the 700. His horse had been killed under him in the first impact. He'd fought on foot, surrounded by Turkish soldiers, and somehow survived. He'd killed at least a dozen men. Now he couldn't stop shaking. Eva, a camp follower who'd marched with the army, spent 2 days tending wounded men. She'd held dying soldiers, listened to their last words, closed their eyes when they stopped breathing. She was 23 years old. She'd never be able to forget what she'd seen. Georgian, David's cousin, had taken a lance through his shoulder during the charge. The wound wasn't fatal, but it was serious. Infection was already setting in. He'd survive but carry the injury the rest of his life. Every winter, the shoulder would ache, reminding him of Didgori. The 700 gathered on the evening of August 13th. They'd lost 150 men. The survivors stood in formation, honoring their dead. No speeches, no ceremonies. Just silence and shared grief. These were the men who'd broken an empire, who'd done the impossible. And they understood the cost better than anyone. A fifth of their number dead. Their brothers, their friends. The men they'd trained with, fought beside, trusted with their lives. David walked among them that evening. He spoke to each group, thanked them, mourned with them. He made promises. The families of the fallen would be cared for. Their names would be remembered. Their sacrifice would not be forgotten. But words felt hollow. Nothing could replace the men they'd lost. No gratitude could heal the wounds. No glory could bring back the dead. Night fell over Didgori again. The pyres still burned, casting flickering light across the valley. The army settled into exhausted sleep. They'd won. They'd survived. But the cost of victory lay heavy on everyone. David stood alone on the command ridge, looking south where the Seljuk army had fled. The empire would hear about this. They'd know their army had been destroyed. They'd know Georgia had done the impossible. But they'd also know the price. Both sides had paid in blood. That was the truth of war. There were no clean victories, no triumph without tragedy. Just survivors trying to make sense of slaughter. Tomorrow they'd march to Tbilisi. Tonight they'd mourn the dead. News of Didgori's victory spread through Georgia within days. Messengers rode to every town and fortress, carrying reports that seemed too incredible to believe. The empire's army destroyed. The kingdom saved. The impossible achieved. The immediate strategic impact was enormous. Tbilisi, Georgia's ancient capital, had been held by Seljuk Turks for over 400 years. Turkish governors ruled from the citadel. Muslim merchants controlled the markets. Georgian Christians were second-class citizens in their own capital. With the Seljuk field army annihilated, Tbilisi's garrison was isolated and outnumbered. They had no reinforcements coming, no relief army, no support from the empire that had abandoned them. David didn't wait. August 20th, 8 days after Didgori, he marched south with his army. The road to Tbilisi lay open. The countryside erupted in celebration as Georgian soldiers passed through villages that had been paying tribute to Turkish overlords for generations. By September 1st, David's army surrounded Tbilisi. The Turkish garrison, approximately 3,000 troops, faced a choice: fight and die, or evacuate while they still could. They chose survival. September 10th, the garrison withdrew under negotiated terms. They were allowed to leave with their weapons and personal possessions. In exchange, they surrendered the city intact. No burning, no slaughter, no destruction. David entered Tbilisi on horseback, riding through gates that had been closed to Georgian kings for 4 centuries. The population, Georgian Christians who'd lived under Turkish rule lined the streets. Some wept, some knelt. Some stood in stunned silence, unable to believe what they were seeing. The liberation wasn't completely peaceful. Georgian mobs attacked Turkish merchants and their families. Old grudges, decades of resentment, exploded into violence. David's soldiers struggled to maintain order. Some Turkish civilians were killed before order was restored. David publicly condemned the violence, but privately understood it. 400 years of occupation creates hatred that doesn't disappear just because an army leaves. He issued strict orders. No more reprisals. Anyone caught attacking civilians would be executed. The violence stopped. June 1122. David was crowned King of Kings in Tbilisi's Sioni Cathedral. The ancient coronation ceremony, not performed in centuries, was restored. He wore the crown of Georgian monarchs, held the sword of his ancestors, and swore oaths before God and his people. The ceremony was calculated propaganda. David was declaring that Georgia was not just free but restored. The kingdom that had been scattered and humiliated now stood united and victorious. But David understood that crowns and ceremonies meant nothing if the kingdom couldn't defend itself. He spent the next 3 years consolidating power, fortifying cities, training new soldiers, expanding the army. He also dealt with internal opposition. Georgian nobles who'd collaborated with the Seljuks, who'd profited from Turkish rule, who now faced a king they couldn't control. Some were executed for treason, others were exiled. David wasn't gentle with enemies. The transformation of Georgia after Didgori was comprehensive. The kingdom that had been a dying tributary state became the dominant power in the Caucasus. Territory expanded. Trade routes reopened. Churches were built or restored. Monasteries received royal patronage. David founded Gelati Academy, a center of learning that would become famous across the Christian world. He invited scholars, theologians, philosophers. Georgia, isolated for so long, reconnected with Byzantine culture and European thought. He also continued military operations, small campaigns against remaining Turkish outposts, expanding borders south and east, testing the limits of Seljuk patience without provoking another major war. The Seljuks, meanwhile, were dealing with their own problems. The disaster at Didgori had shattered the empire's aura of invincibility. Tributary states across the Caucasus stopped paying tribute. Armenian nobles openly defied Turkish governors. The entire region became unstable. Sultan Mahmud sent angry letters demanding explanations. Ilghazi, the commander who'd lost at Didgori, fell from favor. He'd live another 10 years, but would never command a major army again. The defeat had broken him. By 1125, David ruled a kingdom transformed. Georgia was no longer fighting for survival. It was thriving. The golden age of Georgian culture, the period historians would later celebrate, began with the victory at Didgori. But David himself was changing. The weight of leadership, the memory of 1,000 dead soldiers, the knowledge of how close they'd come to total defeat, all of it wore on him. He became more religious, more introspective. He spent hours in prayer, seeking forgiveness for the violence he'd ordered. He died in January 1125, age 52. The official cause was illness, probably pneumonia. But those close to him believed he'd simply worn himself out. 3 decades of constant warfare had broken his body. His last words, according to chroniclers, were about Didgori. Remember what we did. Remember what it cost. Remember that freedom is never free. The news from Didgori reached Constantinople, capital of the great Seljuk Empire. 3 weeks after the battle, Sultan Mahmud II received the dispatch in his palace, surrounded by advisors and military commanders. He read it twice, certain there must be an error. 40,000 troops annihilated. His best general defeated. An army that had never lost a major battle destroyed by a kingdom he'd barely considered a threat. The numbers seemed impossible. The report had to be exaggerated. But confirmation came from multiple sources. Survivors straggling back to Turkish territory. Merchants who'd witnessed the aftermath. Spies reporting from Georgia. All told the same story. The empire's army was gone. The psychological impact on the Seljuk leadership was profound. For 50 years, they'd been expanding. Every campaign, every battle, every siege had ended in victory. That created a sense of inevitability. The empire was destiny, unstoppable, blessed by God. Didgori shattered that illusion. If Georgia could destroy a Seljuk army, what did that mean for the empire's other enemies? The Crusader states in Syria, already troublesome, would hear about this. Byzantium, humiliated at Manzikert, but still dangerous, would take notice. Every tributary kingdom would start questioning whether tribute was necessary. Mahmud convened his military council. The debate was heated. Some generals wanted immediate retaliation. Send another army, larger than the first, crush Georgia permanently. Make an example that would terrify anyone else thinking about resistance. Other advisors counseled caution. The empire was fighting wars on multiple fronts. Resources were stretched. Another Georgian campaign would be expensive and risky. What if they lost again? The damage to the empire's reputation would be catastrophic. Mahmud faced a dilemma. Ignoring Didgori meant accepting defeat, encouraging rebellion across the empire. But responding meant gambling more resources on a kingdom that had just proven unexpectedly dangerous. He chose delay. Not retreat, but strategic patience. Let Georgia celebrate. Let David consolidate his gains. Meanwhile, prepare a proper response. A campaign that wouldn't fail because it would be too large and too well planned to fail. But that campaign never came. The Seljuk Empire was already beginning its slow decline. Internal succession disputes, economic problems, wars in Persia draining resources. By the time they could organize another major offensive against Georgia, the strategic situation had changed. Georgia wasn't an isolated kingdom anymore. It had allies, trade, relationships, diplomatic connections. Attacking it meant risking conflicts with Byzantium and the Crusader states. The cost-benefit calculation didn't work. So Didgori's impact was strategic stalemate. The Seljuks couldn't ignore the defeat, but they couldn't effectively respond either. Georgia remained independent, free, and increasingly powerful. The empire's expansion into the Caucasus ended permanently. Military analysts across the medieval world studied Didgori. How had David won? What tactics had he used? Could they be replicated? The answers were uncomfortable for many commanders. David had won through audacity, deception, and concentrated force at the decisive point. He'd done exactly what conventional military wisdom said not to do. Charge directly into superior numbers. Risk everything on a single attack. Lead from the front where kings traditionally didn't belong. But it worked. Because the Seljuks hadn't expected it. Because the 700 were supremely trained and disciplined. Because David's timing was perfect. And because sometimes, when you're facing annihilation anyway, doing the unexpected is the only rational choice. European military theorists would debate Didgori for centuries. Was it brilliant or lucky? Could it work again, or was it a unique circumstance? The arguments continue today. What's undeniable is the outcome. a small kingdom facing an overwhelming empire, chose to stand and fight. Used creativity, courage, and heavy cavalry to shatter an army that should have crushed them. Changed the strategic balance in the Caucasus, and proved that empires aren't invincible. The Seljuk Empire continued for another century and a half, but it never again threatened Georgia with total conquest. Didgori had taught the empire a lesson. Some kingdoms are too expensive to conquer. For Georgia, Didgori became the foundational myth, the moment when the nation refused to submit, the battle where courage overcame numbers, the victory that proved Georgia could survive against impossible odds. Every August 12th, Georgians celebrate Didgori Oba, a national holiday remembering the battle, remembering David and the 700, remembering the 1,000 who died so the kingdom could live. 900 years later, that memory remains central to Georgian identity. The small nation that defied the empire, the warriors who charged into the jaws of death and somehow survived, the king who refused to kneel. That's the legacy of Didgori, not just a battle but a statement. Freedom matters. Courage matters. Sometimes the only way to survive is to do the impossible. Didgori's significance extends far beyond medieval military history. It represents something fundamental about human conflict, power dynamics, and the limits of imperial ambition. Understanding why Didgori matters requires examining what the battle actually accomplished. Militarily, Didgori demonstrated that superior numbers and resources don't guarantee victory. The Seljuks had every advantage: 3-to-1 numerical superiority, better equipment, more experienced commanders, proven tactics, a military system that had conquered half of Asia. They lost because David understood something crucial. In warfare, psychological factors often outweigh material advantages. The Seljuks expected Georgia to fight defensively, to hide in fortresses, to avoid open battle. When David charged directly into their center, he shattered their assumptions and their morale. The 700 heavy cavalry were the delivery mechanism, heavily armored riders trained to fight as a single unit. Moving at full gallop, they had enough kinetic energy to punch through lighter cavalry formations. Once they broke the Seljuk center, the rest of the Turkish army collapsed psychologically before it was defeated physically. Modern military analysts recognize this as a masterclass in operational surprise and concentrated force. David took his best troops, hid them until the critical moment, then committed them at the decisive point. He didn't try to match the Seljuks across the entire battlefield. He broke them at one spot and let panic do the rest. But Didgori's real significance was strategic and political. For 50 years, the Seljuk Empire had expanded through a combination of military power and psychological warfare. They won battles, then used those victories to convince other kingdoms that resistance was futile. Surrender now, avoid destruction. Georgia broke that cycle. By winning at Didgori, David proved the empire could be defeated. That encouraged resistance across the Caucasus. Armenian nobles stopped paying tribute. Mountain tribes raided Turkish positions. The entire region destabilized. The Seljuk Empire never recovered its momentum in the Caucasus. They continued to control territory in Anatolia and Persia. But the expansion stopped. Didgori was the high water mark. After that came stagnation and eventual decline. For Georgia, Didgori enabled a cultural renaissance. The golden age of Georgian literature, art, and architecture followed directly from the security David established. The kingdom that had been fighting for survival suddenly had resources for monasteries, universities, and artistic patronage. Queen Tamar, David's great-granddaughter, would rule during Georgia's peak. Her reign, 1184 to 1213, saw Georgian power extend from the Black Sea to the Caspian. None of that would have been possible without Didgori. There's also the question of what would have happened if David had lost. If the 700 had been destroyed, if the charge had failed, Georgia would have fallen. The population would have been enslaved or scattered. The kingdom would have disappeared from history. The Seljuks would have controlled the entire Caucasus. They'd have a clear path to attack Byzantium from the north. The strategic balance in the eastern Mediterranean would have shifted. The Crusader states might have faced additional pressure. European history could have developed differently. That's speculative, but it illustrates the stakes. Didgori wasn't just about Georgia's survival. It affected the broader struggle between Christian and Islamic powers in the medieval period. It preserved a kingdom that would serve as a buffer and cultural bridge for centuries. On a human level, Didgori demonstrates what ordinary people can accomplish under extraordinary pressure. The 700 weren't superhuman. They were soldiers who trained hard, trusted their commanders, and found courage when they needed it most. The civilians who'd fled to Georgia, the women who prepared weapons, the men who fought despite having no military training. They weren't heroes in the traditional sense. They were scared people who chose to stand rather than run. That's what makes Didgori resonate across centuries. It's not about supermen or destiny or divine intervention. It's about humans facing impossible odds and deciding those odds don't matter. Choosing to fight because the alternative, submission, is unacceptable. David IV embodied that principle. He wasn't the greatest military genius in history. He wasn't Alexander or Caesar. He was a competent king who prepared thoroughly, made rational decisions under pressure, and refused to accept defeat. That's the lesson of Didgori. Competence and courage can overcome overwhelming force. Small nations can defy empires. The determined can defeat the inevitable, not through miracles, but through preparation, timing, and the willingness to risk everything. If this story resonated with you, if the 700 Georgian horsemen charging into impossible odds made you feel something, I need to ask a favor. Hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment about what stood out to you. Was it David's leadership? The tactical brilliance? The sheer courage of charging into an army 4 times your size? Share this video with someone who needs to hear about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Because that's what Didgori was. Not a story about superheroes or chosen ones or destiny. A story about scared humans who looked at overwhelming force and decided it didn't matter. Think about that moment when David gave the order to charge. He knew the odds, knew most of his cavalry would probably die, knew that if the charge failed, Georgia would fall and everyone he loved would be enslaved or killed. He charged anyway, because waiting to be destroyed is just dying slowly. Because submission guarantees defeat, but resistance offers a chance, however small. Because some things are worth dying for, even when the odds say you'll lose. The 700 followed him, not because they were fearless. Fear is rational when you're charging 40,000 troops. They followed because they trusted David, because they'd trained together, fought together, believed in something larger than themselves. That's leadership, not speeches or charisma or grand visions. Just competence, shared risk, and the bond between people facing death together. Here's a question worth considering. If you were in the Georgian army at Didgori, knowing the odds, knowing what was coming, would you have charged? Or would you have advised retreat into the mountains? There's no right answer. Retreat was rational. Charging was suicide by every standard military calculation. David chose suicide and somehow survived. But he couldn't have known that beforehand. He made the decision understanding he'd probably die. That's the reality of moral courage. It's not about knowing you'll win. It's about fighting when losing seems certain, because the alternative is worse than death. The 700 proved something that day. That numbers don't determine outcomes, that empires can be defeated, that courage and preparation can overcome overwhelming force. Not through magic or divine intervention, but through physics, psychology, and humans pushing themselves beyond what they thought possible. 900 years later, we remember their names. We tell their story. We study their tactics. Because Didgori wasn't just a battle. It was a statement that freedom matters more than safety. That small nations have the right to exist, even when empires say otherwise. That the human spirit, when pushed to its limit, can accomplish the impossible. David the Builder died in 1125. He was 52 years old, worn out by 3 decades of warfare. He'd saved Georgia, liberated Tbilisi, established a dynasty that would rule for generations. He'd done what everyone said was impossible. The 700, those who survived, went on to fight other battles. Some died in later campaigns. Some lived to old age, telling stories about the day they charged an empire and won. All of them carried Didgori with them until they died. The 1,000 Georgian soldiers who fell at Didgori didn't live to see what their sacrifice accomplished. They died in the charge or the pursuit or from wounds in the days after. They never saw Georgia's golden age, never saw Tbilisi liberated, never knew they'd saved a nation. But we know. History remembers. Every year on August 12th, Georgians celebrate Didgori Oba. They gather at the battlefield, now a memorial, and remember the day their ancestors refused to kneel. That's legacy. That's what matters. Not victory or glory or conquest. The willingness to stand when standing seems futile. To fight when fighting seems hopeless. To charge into the darkness and trust that courage will be enough. In 1121, on a battlefield in the Caucasus, 700 horsemen proved that it was. They broke an empire's army. They saved a kingdom. They showed the world that the impossible is just another word for difficult. History remembers those who stand. The defenders of freedom, the resistors of tyranny, the small nations that refuse to disappear. Didgori stands with Thermopylae, with Agincourt, with every battle where courage defeated numbers. That's the truth of Didgori. Ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances and choosing greatness. Not because they were special, because they decided that submission was worse than death and freedom was worth any price. The Georgian kingdom eventually fell centuries later. Empires conquered it, carved it up, tried to erase it. But Georgia survived. Through occupation, oppression, foreign rule. The nation that refused to kneel at Didgori kept refusing for 900 years. That's the power of one battle. One decision. One charge into impossible odds. It echoes through centuries. It becomes myth and memory and national identity. It proves that history isn't made by empires alone, but by those who resist them. Didgori, August 12th, 1121. 700 horsemen, 40,000 troops, one charge, one victory, one lesson that courage and freedom are more powerful than any army. Remember that. Remember them. Remember what they proved, that the impossible is achievable, that empires can fall, that small nations with brave hearts can shake the world.